Well, I'm going to get us started since we're a little bit past the hour and there may be a few more folks that trickle in as we go along, but let me get us going because we want to maximize the time that we have with our two award winners and who are, I'm sure, very familiar to everyone, but I just wanted to do some introductions, make sure that for those of us who are newer to the organization, that everybody's on the same page with who we are honoring today and who is helping facilitate the session. So first of all, welcome. We're so pleased that you could all join us for our IACM Lifetime Achievement Award session. I'm Zoe Barsanis. I'm the past president of IACM and the chair of the Lifetime Achievement Award Committee this year. And I'd also like to thank Taya Cohen, our current president, and Cindy Wang, our president-elect, who also served on this committee. And I would also like to thank Anne Ten Brunzel, who is the David E. Gallo Professor of Business Ethics at Mendoza College of Business, the University of Notre Dame. She's going to be one of our facilitators today. And she, in conjunction with Tina Diekman, who is the Angus T. Shearer Professor of Ethics at the David Eccles School of Business at the University of Utah, also one of our facilitators today. And the two of them did a wonderful job pulling together a beautiful nominating letter for Max Bazerman. They also contributed to Maggie's letter, as they are both Max and Maggie students. And then I'd also like to recognize Allison Fregali, who will be joining us shortly. She's an associate professor of organization behavior and the Mary Farley Ames Lee Distinguished Scholar at the Keenan Flagler School of Business at the University of North Carolina. She pulled together and coordinated the letter for Maggie, another amazing, beautiful letter. And I want to thank her and everyone who contributed to that letter. She is one of Maggie's more recent students, and she'll be facilitating part of our discussion today as well.
So Allison can't get in, and she'd like somebody to send her the link.
Okay, Brandon, can you take care of that?
Probably.
So Anna, Tina, and Allison are going to be guiding our discussion. We have a number of pastors that we're going to touch upon, and then we'll open up the floor for general question and answer at the end. And as we move along, please feel free to post any questions that you have as we go along in the chat, and we'll try to surface those at an appropriate time. So now it's my great honor to introduce this year's awardees. They're both near and dear to my heart as the faculty who welcomed me into the PhD program at the Kellogg School. And they've both served as steadfast, generous mentors ever since. I can't thank them enough for all that they've done to help me grow as a scholar and a person over the years. And I think as you'll hear from the advice and wisdom they have to share, you'll understand why so many people who've worked with them, both as their students and their colleagues, speak to these exact same points in great depth and with great passion. So Max is the Jesse Isidore Strauss Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. And Maggie is the Adams Distinguished Professor of Management Emerita at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. It goes without saying that Max and Maggie have each published countless articles, a few together. They've authored many books, a few of those together as well, and they've edited influential scholarly research series and journals and taught countless PhD students, all of us here participating in the panel, and many of you out there as well. They've taught MBAs, executives, and practitioners. They have had a huge, huge impact on our field. So first, a few words about Max. He's one of our most influential scholars on negotiation, decision-making, and ethics. And as his letter writers describe, as a decision theorist and psychologist, Max helped build the intellectual foundation of judgment and decision-making. In doing so, he is seen as a central player in the growing bridge between organizational behavior and behavioral economics. His work has contributed greatly to the scholarly debate between the economic perspective that would like to believe in perfect human rationality and the psychological view which highlights the imperfections of human judgment. Max took the central ideas from his work on judgment and decision-making and applied them to the study of negotiations. In doing so, Max, along with Maggie, was responsible for a paradigm shift in the way we think about, study, and teach negotiations. His work has been further extended to the ethics realm, identifying biases that prevent us from acting more ethically toward others and toward society. In short, Max is a giant in this field, and his success in disseminating his research findings through his teaching and integration of his work with societal issues has had a huge impact on practice and real-world government policy. And now a few words about Maggie. She's one of our most influential scholars on negotiations, conflict management, and team-based innovation and problem solving. As one of the contributors to her letter described, it's hard to think of anyone who has done more for the field of conflict management than Maggie. During her illustrious career, Maggie has profoundly changed the face of conflict management research and teaching. She developed the research and initial teaching on negotiation that forms the basis for one of the most popular business school courses worldwide today, negotiation electives as we know them. She also was at the forefront of research and teaching on diversity in teams that forms the the backbone of current thinking and teaching on DEI in organizations. She also personally lived out her work, including mentoring diverse students in the field. So many of the leading female and/or minority deans in our field, for example, trace back to Maggie's mentoring. For her many highly impactful contributions to research, teaching, and service, Maggie is eminently deserving of the IACM Lifetime Achievement Award. So together and separately, they have each made spectacular, exceptional scholarly contributions to our field. They have each driven pedagogical innovations and been hugely instrumental in the growth of negotiations programs and negotiations and conflict management research in business schools. Most important, and I can attest to this personally, they have nurtured amazing families of scholars. Their respective extended families of students and collaborators are distributed throughout the world and are distinguished scholars in their own right. This speaks to the incredible mentors that they both are. They are extraordinarily generous and tireless in their care and support of their current and former students, collaborators, and colleagues. And they have both been hugely instrumental in the advance of women and academics of color in our field and academia more generally. In short, it's their amazing scholarship combined with their creative pedagogy, extensive contributions to practice, and selfless, sustained mentoring that have enriched our shared intellectual landscape and immeasurably strengthened our community of scholars. It is because of their contributions on all of these dimensions that they are each so deserving of the IACM Lifetime Achievement Award. So Max and Maggie, thank you for your many and varied contributions over the years. As always, I can't wait to have you share your wisdom with us. So Anne, take it away.
Hi, everybody, and congratulations, Max and Maggie. As we were going through that history, I thought it was almost exactly 30 years ago that you came into my lives. I think my first interaction was with Max, and I helped, well, my first interaction is its own history when I was deciding where to apply. But my first interaction with you kind of in Kellogg was, I think I helped you with a shark before I actually started in the Allen Center in July of 1991. So amazing how the years go by. But I do want to echo a little bit of what Zoe and all the writers said, and that is, you change lives. I don't think you realize that, but because of you, we all live incredibly happy, fulfilled lives because you took the time to mentor us, right, to spark our interests, and to give us all the tools that it takes to engage in our field. And it really came to being, I had my son's 10 of his cohort, his graduate school cohort, stay at my house the last 3 days. So it was a busy 3 weeks. And they were asking for advice. And I simply said, if you can find yourself some mentors like Max and Maggie, your whole life will be laid out before you. So thank you both for just all you've done for me and everyone else that's here. I know we have a few questions. I'm going to be focusing on the research, but before I do, probably the question people most want to know is, who was your favorite student? No, just kidding. Moving to research, you both took a new field on, as Zoe mentioned, right? You took this kind of decision-making and applied it into negotiations. You look back and you're like, oh, that was easy, right? But I'm sure that it wasn't, right? It never is new to kind of start a new field. How'd you do this? Where did the inspiration came from? Were there obstacles?
Max, let me start off with that because I have a perspective of a doctoral student. So I arrived on the University of Texas campus, and my first memory of Max was he was going from basically faculty office to faculty office, introducing himself because he had also just arrived. And I had been assigned an advisor, which was not Max. It was a guy by the name of Al Shama. You may remember him from Rappaport and Shama, Prisoner's Dilemma. And he thought I would be a great person to help him run endless examples of the PD games, which he had for probably the last 15 years while he was at Texas, had not published a single thing. I was not enamored of that particular strategy. And to shorten the story a bit, Max and I decided to work together, but we had to figure out something to work on. I came to my graduate program with an emphasis in conflict management. That's sort of what I was interested in. And Max actually started off with an interest in control theory, but he had actually heard about the Kahneman and Tversky work, of course, I was not familiar with. And we were actually searching for something with which we could work in common together. And that turned out to be negotiation. So it wasn't from my perspective, any great plan, knowing how it would come out. It was very instrumental and practical. I wanted to work with Max. We had to find somebody to work on. Negotiation seemed like a really good idea because it brought together conflict management and, in this respect, decision-making. So that's sort of my view of how we started.
I don't disagree with anything there, but let me provide some color, because some of the people on this Zoom probably can't imagine the fall of 1979. And to put it into context, at that time, there were 3 business schools in the world that taught negotiations, and 2 of them got started teaching negotiations because Roy Lewicki started the course there. The third would have been a guy named John Hammond, who was a Howard Rafus student who taught much more of a decision analytic class at Harvard. But Roy was basically the person who created the teaching field of negotiations from an OB perspective. And it was not a literature that I particularly knew. Maggie left out a little bit of the kind of social detail. So I was 24 years old and clueless as a first-year assistant professor. And from my perspective, she was like 27 and a half years old, which was old for a doctoral student. And she certainly knew much more about the way the world worked, and much of our kind of early existence consisted of Maggie explaining the social environment around us to me on a pretty regular basis. So the way I recall it was that sort of Maggie was fleeing another potential advisor. I think she was looking for someone who couldn't control her, but she thought she could control. So that made a 24-year-old clueless person a good option. I have this recollection, which may or may not be accurate, that I gave Maggie a list of 3 topics to think about working on together. And she came back and totally ignored the list and described an interest in working on, I think it was power and negotiation. And I said, negotiation kind of isn't a topic. And as we continued to talk, she described negotiations, and I would re-describe it as a decision-making problem that simply had another human being involved. And kind of our decision perspective to negotiation really came out of that very first discussion we ever had on negotiation. And I was kind of obsessed with Kahneman and Tversky's work, and that was the lens that I used to re-describe whatever Maggie was telling me about negotiations. And then we got busy doing experimental studies on the topic of negotiation. So I think that's the same story Maggie told, but maybe with a little bit different tilt.
So were there obstacles? Did people try to tell you this hasn't been done, don't do it?
Yeah, there's 2 pieces. One, my research budget was $2,000 for the year. and so we had to get our work done with fairly limited resources. And even though those were $1979, that really doesn't go so far in terms of subject fees. But this is back in the old days when there were more creative options available. And Maggie and I took to the volunteer task of going to professors who taught very large sections of Management 1 and asked them whether they wanted a week off so that we could run a simulation on Tuesday with different conditions and debrief it on Thursday. So basically, I think we invented the notion of running experiments while you're teaching, and it was our kind of survival mechanism at that time. So certainly one big limitation that is almost hard to imagine is how do you run experiments when you don't have any resources to do it. The other limitation that I think of is I remember one of our one revise and resubmit that we received basically said, this is an okay paper, but the authors really need to cut all this stuff about on the front end about a unique decision perspective to negotiation. They're manipulating two variables just like the rest of us. So, and I can certainly believe that there was something in our presentation that would have annoyed people. But the notion that a decision perspective was a unique perspective was certainly new at that time.
But I also think there was another component, which was a challenge, and that was the acceptability of experimental studies as a form of inquiry. And I cannot tell you how many times I had to, and Max had to write the same boilerplate paragraph about why experimental research was actually a reasonable strategy in order to gain knowledge. And it had to be in every paper. It didn't matter where we published it. It had to be in the paper. And we still faced a huge amount of resistance on the part of our reviewers to even allow this methodology into the published domain. And it was very challenging.
So one of my first papers in JAP without Maggie, it was from my dissertation paper, but the editor sort of accepted it on the fourth round, provided I added colon and a laboratory study. And he clearly meant that in a derogatory sense.
Do you have a favorite paper or a favorite paper with an interesting story? Like,
sure, Anne, your paper on ethical fading.
No.
That's my favorite paper. It comes up over and over again in my life as I moved into ethics.
And if I remember right, you made Dave and I write it, and we said no about 4 times to you.
I don't remember that part.
Yeah, you're a very good negotiator, speaking of which. But one that you wrote, let me be more clear in my question, either separately or together.
I'll go with Bazerman, Magliozzi, and Neale, 1985 OBHDP.
That's just because Tom Magliozzi was on that paper and he's our most famous co-author.
That's one of the reasons, Maggie. So Tom Magliozzi, for those of you who don't know, he was the older brother in car talk, and he was a doctoral student at BU when I was an assistant professor there. So that makes it famous. But I think that it's also a fun paper. Many of the people on this Zoom, if you read it today, would find it kind of experimentally not quite precise or careful enough. But I thought it was one more adaptation of how do you collect data in a novel way that is moderately controlled, and how do you make up methods for doing so. So one of the things that we did, which I still think is fun, and I wish we saw more of, was a sort of an environment for negotiations where you can negotiate with different people, so that you weren't just limited to one person that you were randomly assigned to. So we actually created a competitive market. I think if we did it today, we could do it better. But I think that there were fun experimental details in terms of the methodology. And it's probably the second paper after a Neale and Bazerman paper that studied framing in more than a one-person context. So lots of things that I thought were fun about that one.
So for me, I really do like the paper Max just mentioned, but also in sort of similar vein, there's a paper that Greg Northcraft and I wrote on anchoring. And we had to actually go out into the world and engage with realtors and with real people as well. And it's the only field study that I have ever done. I'm happy about that because it was such a pain to do and to complete. So, but it was a paper that Greg and I did when we were at the University of Arizona, and it gets a lot of laughs these days because when I present the paper, I talk about the price of real estate in Arizona in the 1970s, and they're like, "No way!" It's like, yeah, you could buy a house for not very much, and so
1980s, Maggie.
Okay, 1980s. You're
not that old.
Well, some days I feel that old. You're right. It was 1980s, but it was still really cheap, like $150,000 for a house. So, and in California, we don't even know what that means.
Is there a paper you wish would have gotten more traction, or an idea, or something you started down, a path you started down that you just stopped because nobody seemed interested and you thought they were wrong?
So I mentioned my dissertation paper, JAP 82, and it's from my dissertation reduced to 8 pages. And in it are some of the essence of ideas that you might find in Iyengar and Lepper or in Barry Schwartz's book. But I'm not mad at anybody other than myself that paper didn't have more legs to it. I think that there were just limitations to kind of how I did the paper that affected how influential it was. So when there are lots of things that I've done where I see other younger, smarter scholars come along and do better, and I just think that that's kind of the nature of the scientific enterprise. So there's lots of things that I could redo, that I could have done differently so that my work would have had more attention, but I have no regrets about any of that.
So there was a series of papers that a group of us did, and the group changed, but it was on burdens and benefits, and it was really trying to think about negotiation when you're not negotiating over things you really want, but things that you don't want. And so, and it was surprising that first, these papers got in very quickly. It's not my usual kind of multiple revisions. It was like one and done, excuse me, on all 3 of them. And then pretty much very few people have ever done anything since then. So there have been occasional papers, and some people here have done some of those subsequent work, but it really never took off. And I thought it was a really interesting perspective to look at, negotiating on things you don't want and looking at how our cognitive processes change when we move from not necessarily a frame of positive or negative, but stuff you want versus stuff you don't want.
I think we have one of those, Maggie.
Those. We do.
Along kind of those same lines, although it may not be something you wish would be picked back up, where do you see the field going? What do you see as the opportunities? What do you see as the challenges that likely are different from the opportunities and challenges you faced?
We had an open field. Basically, when we started, negotiation research was about personality theory, or it was game theory where there was perfect knowledge assumed. So, almost anything that we did that could be applied to people who were actually negotiating, right, was sort of a novel contribution. For me, the problem that I face now, and I think it's part of the evolution of the field and of junior scholars, is that I'm not nearly so good at identifying where the new areas are as I used to be. And I am sometimes flummoxed by papers that I think that I'm still writing that I think are really good and don't get the same kind of reception from my reviewers, and papers that I look at and say, really? And they're like, in. So I'm, this is one of those things. It's like, I'm just maybe too old for this now, but I've really not been very good at judging. What I do think, though, is there are some holes, and the holes, which is not necessarily what I think people are going to be interested in, but I think that as we move to a more demographically diverse world where we acknowledge the diversity, we really haven't done a whole lot in our research that addresses the intersectionality of negotiators who may be negotiating across global environments, who may be negotiating because they're demographically quite diverse from the majority of folks that we have done research with. And so I think we have a real opportunity there, but it's a really hard group to get a hold of. Even there was a paper recently that I reviewed on I actually reviewed it and liked it, although it had some problems, which was looking at a population that we've never done research on, and the other reviewers were simply not interested in this. And I was kind of disappointed in that, because it had a really interesting finding that I would like to have figured out why. And to basically reject it in the first round, I thought was short-sighted. So.
You've got us wondering, Maggie, what is that paper?
Well, I'm a reviewer. It was never accepted, so can't talk about it. It's not my paper. I know.
I should know that. I do think about ethics occasionally, but
so methodologically, I think the world's just dramatically different. We mentioned lack of resources and the lack of acceptability of laboratory studies as of 1980, but now all of you have to deal with issues that have been created by the very needed sort of reform movement about p-hacking, and sort of I think that reform is needed. I think that our generation, I'm speaking of Maggie's generation, my generation, sort of did too little to create a more ethical environment in terms of the publication process. But we our generation created the problem and then left it for you, which wasn't very nice. But you now need to deal with a very, very different set of rules in terms of what's necessary in terms of the publishing process. In terms of content, first of all, I look out at what's going on at IACM. And it's much more conflict-oriented, dispute-oriented, pure negotiation, as we would have thought about it 30 years ago, is a less significant part of the overall field. And that sounds just fine. But I think it's a much broader field today than it was 30 years ago. And then in terms of how negotiation is going to develop, I think it's going to develop based on a variety of contemporary trends in society more broadly. And Maggie already kind of talked about diversity, and that sounds right on target. But I would also say that we have a world where people are going to be negotiating online more often, or transacting online more often, and that's going to raise new issues like honesty and integrity. So one of the things that I'm fascinated with is, how do you get people to tell the truth online? And I think that that's a very different topic than getting people to tell the truth in person. So I think that that's the kind of thing that comes up because of broader changes in society. Or we could think about how all these startups that we now see coming out of our students who graduated recently, how are they going to evolve their company? So we used to think about, you stayed private for a very long time, and then you went through, and if you were very, very lucky and successful, you'd go public through a traditional IPO process. And we didn't really talk about negotiation as part of an IPO process. But now that we see much more different forms of venture capital, of private equity, of SPACs or special purpose acquisition corporations affecting the nature of the evolution of companies, I think negotiation has a dramatically larger role to play in the growth of organizations. So I think that there's going to be sort of a new set of connections between negotiation and entrepreneurial finance that we've never thought very much about. So, I don't view myself as a futurist, so I'm describing to you what is already well recognized in terms of changes in society and thinking about how it connects to negotiation, as opposed to telling you what the next thing will be that will affect negotiations on a secondary basis.
Very cool. Cool ideas, you guys. You're a little hard on yourself, Max. I was just telling this group of PhD students that we were talking about the p-hacking and the increased kind of necessary stringent requirements. And I said, well, we had our own rule, and it was, Tina will know what I'm going to say, what would Max do? That was what we asked each other all the time in our own collaborations without you. So you were kind of our ethical bar. Because I remember in a paper, Tina and I thought maybe we could exclude some data, and you made us footnote it. And I was the second year, and I'll never forget that you made us do that, which was a great.
Well, thanks for remembering that. But unfortunately, some people listening know that I published a paper, which I was part of the team that published a failure to replicate paper to follow it. And I think that the original paper on signing first only came to fruition because of bad research practices. And I don't think that I did anything ethically wrong. On the other hand, I do think that I was negligent in not being persistent enough to see the problems that had been created in the creation of that paper.
But owning up to it also is a great act. So I will end there. There will certainly be time for questions and answers on the research perspective, but now I'd like to turn it over to Tina Diekman, my dear friend, a mentor, and one of my, if not my favorite co-author, to talk about collaboration.
Thank you.
Not your favorite? I'm not your favorite co-author, Anne.
She said
One
of my favorites.
Yeah. So I also want to congratulate you, Max and Maggie, for this award, and also acknowledge kind of the profound impact you have had on me professionally, but also personally. I mean, I think that Anne sparked a memory of being in the doctoral program together and just all the fun times. Clearly, there were always stressful times because as a PhD student, there was stress, but you made it possible to kind of get through those despite all the stressors, professional stressors as well as personal stressors. I mean, I just remember hanging out in Maggie's office with Jeff and just hanging out and just enjoying the time, and also talking to Max in the hallways, and just getting all those little snippets of advice, and also the keep up the good work. And so not only just learning how to do research, but just the support, and the learning how to do research and learning how to collaborate effectively. And that's sort of the section that I'm going to focus on, is that collaboration process. And so what I'm wondering about is, what do you think, if you look back on your collaborations and you look at other successful collaborations, what do you think are the keys to that success? I mean, what is important for you and your collaborations? Is there a particular process that you've negotiated that's the same across all your successful collaborations? Or, do those change depending upon who you're working with? So that's kind of what first question I want to start off with.
That's a really big question. So first, let me just say that Greg Northcraft and I published a paper in a book, edited volume by Keith Murnion on collaboration negotiation. So 1993, feel free to look at that. But for me, the issue is one of relationships. And that is, I mean, if I had to sort of distill down what that means, it means that I actually care about my co-authors, and that we have a connection that is not only research focused, but also a personal relationship. And to the extent that my co-authors are junior faculty or doctoral students, that relationship is one where sometimes it's a painful relationship because, you know, so I remember a comment that my doctoral student friend and colleague Kathy Phillips said at my retirement party, when she said she opined about one time when she cried in my office, and then she looked at the group who was assembled for dinner and said, "How many of you cried in Maggie's office?" And pretty much everybody raised their hands. And so there was a lot of crying in my office as well, but that was a supportive crying because people understood that I cared about them, and that's why sometimes you had to be tough. With my more peer colleagues, the issue is one of relationship and actually complementarity. You know, what kind of skills and abilities, this seems much more instrumental, but sort of, you know, where are the skills and abilities that, you know, that one of us has that the other one doesn't have, or one of the preferences that one of us has that the other has, to make it fit together, to make it easier to do work. Because sometimes there are things that I just don't do very well, and it's great when I have a co-author who's really good at that stuff.
It was pretty good. So I don't think I have anything unique from what Maggie said. And I heard her say, you should work with nice people who you like because it takes a while, and that just will help you solve the little bumps in the road. And then I really like the complementary piece as well. So all of my doctoral students, and many of them are on this Zoom, but they all do lots of things better than I can do them. And that's kind of important, so that that my students have never just been kind of implementing what I told them to implement. So I think that one of the reasons that our doctoral students collectively succeed, I'm talking about Maggie's students and my students, is that they're not research assistants. They're sort of learning how to do this craft on their own. And in the process, I think Maggie and I have both taken advantage in a positive way of the things that they know how to do better than we know how to do. And that creates a good collaboration. And I think that applies to non-student collaboration as well. So most of my collaborators, where the collaborator is a peer rather than a student, tend to be people in other fields, in psychology and economics and philosophy. And one of my goals is always to both learn from their wisdom, but also to be able to do things that I couldn't do without them being part of the project. So I think looking for complementarity while also finding people who you want to spend 3 years of your life sort of linked to is pretty good advice. And then all those other things about the details of how to solve problems are just easier if you have those two pieces going for you. So I think I just said I agree with Maggie in a long-winded way.
So if you think about your collaborations, I mean, how do you negotiate sort of the roles and responsibilities? You know, who does what and who does what when? So I mean, is that collaboration specific, or is that something that, you know, how do you go about doing that?
I rarely negotiate anything on the front end. I think that people have some sense of how I work. So I've often worked with new students who learn from more senior students. So Anne learned from Tina, and Kim learned from Anne, and that was a kind of a common process for me. And I think that there's a pretty natural norm that the doctoral student puts in more hours, and hopefully the kind faculty mentor does things where they have a unique advantage and that they solve problems that come up that would be very awkward for a doctoral student to solve. And they worry about what to do when another faculty colleague gets pissed off about something. So whatever problems are awkward for the doctoral student, the faculty member should step in. If the faculty member is better at some tasks, they should do it. So this should be solved based on, I now spend more time thinking about the philosophy of ethics. And so I think of it as a utilitarian decision problem at this point. How do we create the most good with a limited amount of resources going into the project? That was a pretty geeky way of answering you. Sorry.
So I also don't negotiate up front. It's an evolution, but what I am clear about is that and you can look at my Vita and see that this is true. I'm a last in a line author because my career has been made. I have tenure. I have, I don't need to be high in the authorship status, which means that the responsibility goes to the more senior authors who are more junior, and part of the learning process is how to manage that. So I agree with Max that if there's some problems where they need cover, that's part of my job. But my job is also, and this is one of the things that my doctoral students will, I think, suggest that it is true, is that I meet them where they are in terms of their interests. And so, I remember very clearly one of my students, Jeff Polzer, to be specific, who said to me, I don't want to do negotiation because I don't want to be a clone. And I said, well, number one, we are about the same height and we're both blonde at the time. So, maybe the people could confuse us. But he said, I want to do stuff on teams. And I said, well, that's good, but I don't know anything about teams. And he said, well, we can all learn together. And so we did. And, that opened up a whole new area of research for me because of his taking the lead in what he wanted to do his dissertation on. And so, for me, that's exactly what that collaboration is all about. And it's happened numerous times with doctoral students who have basically helped me redefine who I am as a researcher because of their interests and my willingness to say, hey, let's see what happens. I don't know anything about this particular area, but let's learn together. And I think it's really useful for me as a scholar to have that perspective. I think I'd be really bored if I were still doing the same kind of studies I was doing. No disrespect with Max, back in the day, right? Neither one of us want to do those studies anymore because that's what we did back then, and now we're different people and we have different interests.
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead, Max.
Oh, that's good. Yep.
So you brought up the issue of sort of doctoral students and junior faculty working with you as senior faculty. And I'm going to kind of venture into sort of some of the more advice things that Allison will be talking about shortly. But this has to do with collaboration. So I asked my doctoral students that I'm working with, what would they want to learn or hear from you? And one of the questions was a junior faculty member, how do you sort of manage the collaborations with senior faculty member if you're a doctoral student in particular? So do you have advice? One for you, Maggie, if you have a passion about a research idea, go for it, propose it with your senior faculty member, but any other sort of concrete advice that you could provide PhD students and junior faculty working with more senior faculty if they're kind of leading the project?
So I think that one of the big things that a lot of people in this Zoom have studied is the need to take the perspective of the other party. And when you don't do well in negotiation. And I think you probably don't do well as a collaborator either. So I think that for negotiating up, you want to take the perspective of the advisor so that you're so that there's good reason why they want to work with you, and not only work with you to find the work fascinating and to work hard to bring the work to fruition and to value the project above other projects. So I think by thinking about how do I make this project a good deal for the other side, it makes it a whole lot easier to put together a successful collaboration. And I think that works from the senior position as well. How do you create things that you're going to provide that are going to create a reputation that are going to lead other doctoral students or other junior faculty members to want to work with you? And to get too good of a deal on the current project is probably a really bad idea in academia, because reputations spread very, very quickly.
One of the things that I think that one of the advice that I continue to give students who, whether they're mine or other people's students or just people showing up in the doctoral program, is to take the initiation, to initiate contact with senior faculty, because a lot of times when doctoral students start off, they're wondering, well, should I wait for them to come to me? And my response is never wait for them to come to you, because they won't. And it's not a negative, it's just, it is. And those of you who are senior faculty know that, you have to do a lot of stuff. And it's not that you're not interested, it's just that you just can't figure out how to do it sometimes. And so to be proactive, and to actually do what Max just said, which is say, how can I basically facilitate this process? And, it turns out that those, the new ideas that these students bring, the junior faculty bring, are critical. And, as I've already said, it's just basically the fuel for continuing my evolution as a scholar was my students. And so, I hope they show up. I hope they come into my office, they knock on the door, they basically push and shove. And it was one of the things that I was really proudest of, sort of in a weird kind of way, is I actually only taught one doctoral course in my entire life. That's not what I'm proud of, but what I'm proud of is I had lots of doctoral students, because I didn't need a course to get people to come and work with me. People wanted to work with me, and that was because of how this process evolved. And so for me, that was always a fight in many of the universities I was a part of about who was going to teach the doctoral students so they could get students to do research with them. And my response was, go right ahead. Basically my reputation will bring doctoral students in.
A more specific question one of my students had was, how do you, as a student, how should you go about getting your faculty if they're not engaging in a project? They're sort of just not responding. They're not, doing the work that they should be doing. So how is a junior faculty member sort of managing up, as it were, on those things? I mean, obviously being proactive and communicating effectively. Do you have any advice in that dimension?
I think you want to try to take their perspective. Why aren't they doing what you want them to do? Is it because they were a bad choice to begin with and you need to extricate yourself out of this relationship? Or is it that there's a methodological problem and they don't know the solution? Is it because they find other projects more interesting, so you're just losing out with limited time? Or is there something funky going on in their life and they just don't have the time to get to it? And I think you need to figure out what's going on, and that may mean a conversation to find out what the limitation is. I think it's also useful to think about, what are you doing that's keeping the other party in the collaboration from doing what you want them to do? Because there's often an awful lot of reciprocity. So when you like your collaborator, they tend to like you. And when you are having significant problems in a collaboration, turns out that they don't view you as completely innocent from the problems that have developed. So I think you want to try to take their perspective and understand what's going on, because that can lead you to very, very different paths forward in terms of how to deal with that difficult situation.
So I agree with Max. I want to just put a little bit of amplification on one component, and that is that not all research relationships work. And part of it is you should do all those things Max just said. You should take the perspective. You should try to figure it out. But at the end of the day, if it's not working, get the project done, move on. You know, basically, maybe you do more than your share. That's fine. Do more than your share. Learn from it, you know, and update.
Yeah, I see that Don Moore has in the chat, how do you guide students through the ethical dilemma inherent in the choice between claiming and creating value? I assume that means in collaboration, Don.
I was actually thinking about larger classes, MBA students, not just doctoral students and advisees. Answer in any way that suits you.
Got it. So I'll answer it in collaboration, and then I'll try your broader question. I think that when in doubt, create value as a priority while keeping some notion of claiming in mind. So if it's a research collaboration, don't worry so much about the amount of work put in and the credit. Just come up with the best way to work with that person to get a great product and deal with claiming over time. And certainly the better the relationship, the easier it's going to be to solve claiming in our field where we can rotate authorship and things like that. I think that in teaching negotiations, it makes sense to think about more creation rather than claiming, because our students have better natural intuition about claiming, and they know almost nothing about value creation. So I think teaching value creation, not just in negotiation, but as a way of life. How do you create the most value possible in your 80,000 hours that you have available for work, is a pretty good way to go through life. But it would be naive to say claiming doesn't matter. I just think that the weight should go dramatically toward creation. Sorry if I went off target. I thought that your question was
fine. That actually,
I didn't know Don Moore was going to ask a totally irrelevant and orthogonal question to what we were talking about.
Well, but that actually raises a good point. If anyone has any questions about anything that we're discussing here or any others, just put it in the chat. And after, I'm going to turn it over to Allison next to talk more specifically about advice for junior scholars. After that session, there's going to be a question and answer period. And so then we'll address any remaining questions that are in chat or any new questions that come up. So I'm going to pass it off now to Allison. And again, I want to congratulate you, Max and Maggie, for just such a great service to the field. And it was just a pleasure for me to celebrate this with you.
Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, Tina.
And let me add my congratulations as well. I'm, of course, not at all surprised, extremely happy and very flattered to be part of the party. So the third category of thinking about your reflections on your career is advice that you have to offer for younger scholars. And some of that has come up in the context of the research identity and the collaboration. And this particular section is very meaningful to me because particularly having spent a lot of time with Maggie, more so than with Max, but I have just been the recipient of decades worth of advice that I continue to still rely on to this day. And I remember thinking, like, when I'm 30, will I need to call Maggie to hear what she thinks? And the answer was yes. And then when I'm 40, will I need to call Maggie and hear what she thinks? The answer is yes. And then 50, I'm not quite there yet, but I'm closer to that than I am to 40. And I'm sure the answer will be yes. So one of the things when I was thinking about this was how many different, what I call Maxisms or Maggieisms there are, pieces of advice that you have offered over the years that people remember and they associate with you and they've benefited from, and they repeat to their own students and their own colleagues. And Maggie, I remember a lot of them from you. I remember I showed you the first paper I ever wrote, which was not for you, it was for a class. And you actually had the kindness to read it. And I think back on that you read a paper that I wrote for someone else's class just to read it. And you said it was a good first paper. And I said, oh, that's really like great. It's a good paper. And you said, no, I didn't say it was a good paper. I said it was a good first paper. And there's a distinction. And she said, you said, you're writing an argument, you're not writing an encyclopedia. And I said, okay. But I've like remembered those kinds of things and passed them on many, many times. So thinking about your favorite pieces of advice, that's my question to you, the Maxisms and the Maggieisms. What are the favorite or best pieces of advice you think you've offered in mentorship over the years?
So there's one that I offer repeatedly, and it gets repeated, but it's kind of, is that life is too short to clean your own toilets and to drink bad wine. So, basically basically what I'm trying to tell folks is you need to decide where you want to spend your time and don't be cheap about it, because the benefits that accrue to you from doing what you love and doing what you're good at and doing what you need to do will offset the costs that you will incur.
So I think of particularly doctoral students, but I think that this works for junior faculty as well, thinking about working with senior colleagues. So what degree do you want to work with someone senior versus be independent? And I think that the answer is you need to develop the craft. That is, how do you do this work and do it extremely well? And for that, you need advice and you need to work with people who know how to do the craft. Yet you also want to be thinking about, by the time I get on the job market or by the time I come up for promotion, how am I known for my own thing? So I think developing both the requisite skills and also being able to identify your independent contribution at the same time is kind of what feels like a trade-off, but I think you need to balance both of those to get it right in our field.
I think Ann's comment was nice. It's one of those things that is one of my Maxisms, and that is that he continued to offer to buy insurance about negative outcomes happening in my life because he didn't think they'd happen. And he obviously continued that with Ann and other folks in different situations.
Yeah, so basically I offer people very bad insurance policies on things that they're worrying too much about. And they generally turn it down, but then they feel better because I was willing to make them a bet on the likelihood that they would have a fine job offer to take. So there are many people on this Zoom who have received my insurance policy offer on their job search. Maggie's husband, Al, wanted to get some watches out of Russia, and he became obsessed that he was going to get arrested at some border control. So I took the watches, took an insurance policy fee, and then I gave him his watches back on the other side of the border control. And everybody was better off as a result. He saved worrying more at an amount that was worth more to him than the money that he gave me, and I got money, and I never really was worried too much about going to a Russian jail.
That's amazing. I like this one also that Terry said on your first day of grad school, more work you do will end up in the garbage than anywhere else. So don't give up. Do you remember that, Max?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, it's
there's lots of things I've said I don't remember.
I still tell all of Maggie's jokes after years and years of TAing. They still hold Maggie. Including, with the potential exception of your current and future spouse, never fall in love with more than one of anything. So
that was a Max thing, by the way.
Was
I
it?
From Max.
I made that up.
That's how they get passed down.
Yeah.
Amazing. So when you think about giving advice, right, people also need to be receptive to advice. And so we're curious about some of the mistakes that you've seen people starting out in their careers, whether as doctoral students or as junior faculty, make, and whether you advise them against it or not. What are some of the mistakes you see people make, and what would you advise them to be doing instead?
One of the easiest ones, and I've seen this multiple times, is to fight over authorship. So the simple rule is if you're about to have a dispute about who gets to be first author, let them win, because the cost of disputing is so much higher than the difference in the outcome, that this is kind of an easy no-brainer. And I can think of multiple stories, which I won't tell, where people wanted to create completely ridiculous disputes about authorship. And it goes to lots of negotiations, but it's important to think about their perspective. If they're claiming something that sounds unfair to you, they probably have a very different narrative of the experience than what you're working with. So figure out how to get out of that story, concede, and move on to have a better life. And again, it's just very easy to come up with examples where people have fought over authorship and have paid enormous costs as a result of the loss of collaboration.
This is one of the things that I learned from Max a long time ago, and I have operationalized, and that is, I don't fight over authorship, and I'm not on authorship teams that do fight over authorship. Now, I may be on one at the moment, and we may get that paper published, and then I'm not on that team anymore, because this is a collaborative process. And that notion of fighting over authorships is really, for me, an issue around trust, and not trusting that the folks' contributions will be reflected, maybe not in this round, but in a subsequent round. But it's, this is a long game, and fighting over authorship is a short game, and it also doesn't reinforce that relationship thing that I think is so important.
Yeah, and it's what's interesting and really is that a lot of these pieces of advice I only heard from Maggie, because obviously, Max, you and I were never at the same institution. And so to see that there's all of that shared advice, because I had learned that long ago from Maggie and have passed it on many, many, many times. I did notice that there is a t-shirt with Maxisms. So I didn't realize, Max, you had merch, which is amazing. And I feel like we should have a like similar shirt with Maggieisms.
I think Ting is on the Zoom, and she may have been the creator of the T-shirt. I'm not sure. Yeah, but there's also a T-shirt that Max's Lab is for Obama as well. So there have been a few kind of lab-related things. Is that true, Ting, that you created the Maxism T-shirt?
This was the Wool and I and Francesca lab. We created it. I think you're about to move to Berkeley. This is
yeah. So thank you, Oval. Yeah.
Of course, our pleasure. Of course, Max. Thank you for everything.
So one more question then we can open up for Q&A from everybody. Thinking about, so this idea of mentoring younger scholars, what advice do you have for being a good mentor? Because I do think that both of you have invested tremendously in mentorship. And although I can repeat the pieces of advice, you realize that the investment and the mentorship is not nearly as easy when you're doing it as when you're receiving it. And so in terms of talking to people here about how to be a really high quality mentor to junior people, what advice do you offer?
I often tell junior colleagues that they should go talk to someone else instead who could give them better advice. And that seems like shockingly useful things to do. So one of the things that I find with aging, and I don't mean to insult any of the other people who are in my age category,
Or older.
or even older, but it may be that the best advice peaks at an age significantly below mine. And that may have to do with sort of the tasks that we choose to use to put together our career and things like that. So I would never tell a doctoral student or a junior faculty member that I don't want to read their paper. But on the other hand, sometimes I think that people will look to someone past their peak for advice giving, for advice on a particular problem. When I think, but I know 3 other people in this unit who I would trust their advice over mine. So why don't you kind of go talk to them. So I think it's useful for all of us to be thinking about what can we give very good advice to, and where are we better off kind of deferring to other people to provide that kind of advice. And in fact, that your willingness to identify where your advice may not be the best may make you a pretty good advisor.
Yeah, and I think that for me, the notion of how to be a good mentor revolves again around the fact that I actually care about what happens to my students, and not just my students who are currently PhD students, but my students who are in various stages of their careers. And so, you know, I find it no greater compliment than for my students, including Allison, who continues to ask, and that's great. I love it. For advice, that is, you know, wonderful, because you guys aren't asking me about what's the best analytic technique to use in this paper. And that's good, because I have no idea. But I do know a lot about how to be an academic, and for my female doctoral students, how to be and colleagues, how to be a female academic. And sometimes those are really challenging problems that you kind of have to address in your organizations. And so, you know, those are the kind of things that for me are very important components of what makes a good mentor, or at least how I see myself as a mentor. That is to sort of really talk frankly about some of the challenging problems that aren't specific to a particular research project.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on, we're going to open it up to the whole group for questions, but any other thoughts on mentorship or advice to younger generations of scholars that we didn't ask about that you wanted to offer?
I just want to amplify one thing, and that, or maybe two things. Mentoring takes a lot of time, but it is an investment, and it creates huge amounts of benefits. And so I just, you know, for me, this is the main reason that I stayed in academia as long as I did, is because of my students and because of the experience of watching their evolution as well as my own. And so, you know, this was my third career as being an academic. I had two other careers before I started this one, but this is the one that stuck. And I think that that's really a function of my relationship with my co-authors and my students.
Sounds good. And anything else I have to say is on the T-shirt, and Ting put it into the chat.
That's perfect. Well, thank you to you both. So I'll start with one question that came in while we were earlier, while we were talking back to studies of negotiation, and your opinions on why are there so few qualitative studies in negotiation research, and how do you evaluate the potential of qualitative methods in the field?
Well, I think if you want to know why there aren't more, it's probably because people aren't writing enough of them, and the people on this Zoom are rejecting them when they do come in. So, so the problem would lie with the rest of you. So, I haven't rejected a qualitative paper in decades. I'm not sure. I think that's because I haven't received one to review. But I think that. I mean, I think that question can sound a whole lot like Maggie and myself asking that question about lab studies in 1982 or 1983. I think that the key is how do you write a qualitative paper so that the reader is going to learn something about human behavior that they didn't know before. So I certainly read lots of things that are qualitative. So my apologies to the rest of you, but Michael Lewis is my favorite nonfiction writer, not anyone on the Zoom today. And I think that he does some version of qualitative research, and he tells me things about the world that I didn't know, even if I was a little bit disappointed with his most recent book. But he often this comes up with unique insights and provides me with enough convincing evidence to believe them. So I find that quite intriguing. In terms of the norms of qualitative research making it into the very best journals. Quite honestly, I'm ill-equipped to give you an answer to that question. I don't have enough insight in terms of the process of qualitative papers going through that process.
I'm just going to say what he said.
Yeah.
Perfect, thanks. If other people have questions, comments, stories, we can open it up either in chat or just to come off mute and ask your questions.
Well, maybe we should ask Michael Mann, who I think asked that question, whether we're being responsive or whether he wants to express something different about the field of negotiation and qualitative research.
Yeah, thank you very much, Max. I also can congratulate you and Maggie Neale, of course. I just wanted to ask for the author that you mentioned. I didn't get the name.
Michael Lewis,
Michael
L-E-W-I-S. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. But yeah, I'm very happy with the answer. Thank you.
That's enough silence. Anybody can yell anything out that they want.
Actually, I'll chime in with one as we're waiting for the others' thoughts to percolate. Separate from the, there are two questions I have. One, as you were talking, Max, about your earliest days at Texas and limited resources in terms of doing research. And I think about, you know, the movement and the trend towards more and more studies, and partly in response to some of the weaknesses that we've had in our approach to doing the research, as well as just, you know, the number of studies that we now package together. And I think about folks who are institutions like I am that still are resource impoverished. And so then thinking about creative ways to actually do the research, especially when we're in a sense, a world where there are higher and higher requirements, resource intensive requirements in terms of the nature of the research we're doing. And if you have any good advice to offer in terms of creative approaches, or thinking about where and how to combat the challenges associated with that.
So, one of our friends gave us the Cambridge edition of Monopoly. And so Marla and I have been playing Monopoly. And I don't think that I've played Monopoly in 55 years, but I liked it as like an 8-year-old. And it's kind of sociologically stunning in the sense that when one side has lots of resources and the other side doesn't, the game's really over long before it ends. That you can't really catch up, and that may mirror a lot about economic inequality. Not that you can't, but just the magnitude of the difficulty of it. So I don't think that there's anything that I could tell you about how to sort of make things fair for publishing between a less wealthy state university and many of the most elite schools that seem to give you close to unlimited resources to publish your work. So I don't think that there's any great answer to that. But I do recall 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected president, and we thought that was about the worst thing that could ever happen in this country. And one of the things that happened with the Reagan presidency is money for social science research dried up dramatically. There was a guy named Zick Rubin, who was a social psychologist at the time, who left social psychology to become a lawyer and a book agent. He wrote a piece in Psychology Today that basically said, now that we don't have all those resources, maybe we have to think before we go out and collect our data. That doesn't solve the inequity that you're describing, but I think that the less I had resources, the more I would be spending time thinking about the ideas that I'm going to pursue. So I use my limited chips in the most effective way possible. And other than that, we could start thinking about how to aim for broader legislation for how to create more fairness across universities. So there are certainly people who have suggested things like, why is the federal government funding private universities? They have enough public universities to fund. That's a very different idea, and there are obviously counters. So there are some societal questions which I can't resolve, but I would say whenever I'm lacking resources, I want to think about how to use those resources as effectively and efficiently as possible.
So it seems to me that there are a couple of ways to think about this, and I want to sort of first I want to reinforce what Max just said at the very end there, because I think it's really important. You know, when you had to collect subjects, human subjects, two people at a time, and they had to come in, you had to schedule them, and you had to kind of cajole them to come in, and you didn't have labs. I mean, you know, or people who were, you know, paid to do that for you. You had to, I mean, I was on the phone as a doctoral student, you know, and my most effective strategy was when I was sick and people felt sorry for me, so they came in to do my studies, right? So, but it did require that when you decided to actually run a study, that you really worked on making sure it was as good as possible, and not, you know, a lot of pre-testing, a lot of, you know, we're going to do this one study and see if it works. We're going to, you know, basically just because we can churn through subjects. If you have the money, if you don't have the money, it's still a whole lot easier because, you know, of the technology that allows us to do this. But I don't think it makes us better. But instrumentally, how do we think about this? Number one, choose co-authors who come from wealthy schools. So that's number one. You know, I have been in a position, having been first at a poor school, the University of Arizona but we were able to have access to lots of students and classes. So we collected huge amounts of data through that. But then after that, I went to places where the resources were much more munificent and didn't have that problem anymore. But I also sometimes really was very interested in having co-authors who had really good ideas but didn't have the money, and I had the money and sometimes not very good ideas. So that what a great complementarity. But I also just want to put a shout out to one of my doctoral students and co-authors, Peter Bellamy, who has been amazing in figuring out how to collect real world data outside of MTurk. And so he made the most recent one that I was impressed by was his ability to make a connection with a Mexico City bank who was doing loans, and he got all sorts of resource based information about these folks and helped create an entire paper around the inequality of the bank's behaviors in the context of one of our studies. And so it was just like stunning. And, you know, he basically worked with them to help them figure out how to be better. And they, in return, gave him access to their client base, which was, you know, but so, I mean, it's creative. But again, it's always a challenge.
Great. Thank you for sharing those ideas and insights. Allison, we have had a few more questions come in. You want to share those?
We do have a couple more questions, all really interesting. All right, so just in order that I see them. So Taya asks, what are some of the ways your thinking and interests have changed over the years? What have you learned and ways in which you think differently now than you might have early on? And I think you could interpret that from research, from just your career, from life. What have you sort of changed or evolved your opinion on over the years?
So I think that for across the last 40 years, I've been pretty consistent in having a kind of a decision lens to understand how people actually do things with a prescriptive orientation of how to turn that into something better. So using description for prescription. So that's been pretty consistent, but your question is about change. And obviously this is a International Association of Conflict Management. So we're talking about the negotiation work that Maggie and I did. Maggie moved on to teams. You know, I've clearly moved on to ethics. So, you know, where did I first start thinking about ethics? Well, Ann Ten Brunsel and Dave Messick were the ethics people when I was hanging around Kellogg, and a little bit of that rubbed off on me. And I worked with Ann and Dave to some degree at time at Kellogg. But then when I showed up at Harvard, I started working with Dolly Chugh and Mahzreen Banaji. And the kind of combination of Ann and Dolly clearly had an enormous influence on changing the focus of my attention from maximizing the outcomes in a two-person game to maximizing outcomes for all sentient beings on the planet. And so Ann and Dolly get as much credit for shifting the focus of what I want to maximize as anybody I could think of.
So my focus historically has been one on realizing synergy. And whether that's in the context of a two-person negotiation or a team, or trying to create an equitable and fair organization, culture, world. Those are the things that have evolved. What has changed is the focus has gotten bigger. It used to be two people, right? Two parties, and now it's multiple parties. And I also think too, as Max suggests, is that again, what has changed is the engagement with various doctoral students who have really caused me to adjust my focus, and part of what I've talked about earlier in that transition, whether it was students who were interested in diversity. Kathy Phillips was big in that transformation for me, whether it was teams, which Jeff was really the kind of pivot point there. And Peter Bellamy, who is now doing a whole lot of work on inequality and status, which is, sort of where I am right now in terms of that sort of perspective. So it's idiosyncratic for me. It's who I run into and who I engage with. And that's what is the agent of change for me.
Thank you both. Cynthia asked, what was the biggest challenge you faced in your career and how did you overcome it?
So as a first-year doctoral student in February, I got a feedback letter from my faculty at Carnegie Mellon that basically is the most negative letter I've ever seen any doctoral student ever receive. So I keep it on file for when a doctoral student's particularly unhappy. I share it with them. But I just didn't know what I was got myself into, and I'm sure I was performing terribly, and I'm sure that my faculty didn't have the social skills for delivering bad news. But certainly, it looked like this social science thing might not be for me. But I kind of just kept working with the attitude, there's some job out there to work out. So I wasn't overly concerned about life not working out, but I certainly thought there was a reasonable chance that I wouldn't make it to the second year of graduate school.
And did you course correct or do anything different?
Max, I'm really glad you did.
I was working a shockingly large number of hours, so I couldn't work harder. And it's whether I worked smarter or not, I don't know. Sanda Kaufman's on the Zoom. She was a fellow graduate student at Carnegie Mellon at that time. So the stats course that I dropped out of in the fall, I'm pretty sure she completed.
Yes, but I had a husband who is a physicist.
Yeah.
So he didn't need to read that. This was the most appalling experience in my life. He didn't need to read the text of the problem. He just solved the equations. So this is like a shock, yes. But it was the hardest course in my life, that econometrics course.
Yeah.
There are a number of things that have been challenging in my life. They range from, at the time they were challenging, they were probably just pretty irrelevant, to some that have been had a long-lasting impact on me. I'll give you one kind of in the middle of the road, and that was the transition from Northwestern to Stanford. And it turns out that was actually a pretty big challenge for me, because I went from a place that that was, you know, in many respects, to talk about Hal Levitt's hot groups during the period of time when Max and I were there with a lot of the people, doctoral students who were there. It was a hot group. You know, we worked all night long, sometimes on studies. It was, as Tina suggested, the coolest thing in the world was to be at work and to be with those folks. And then I went to Stanford and it was like, hello, hello, hello. It was like, I don't know what I did. And I had a particularly bad teaching experience in my first class, in my first thing at Stanford, where a student basically stood up in class and told me, I was, by the way, a full professor at the time, told me I didn't know anything about organizational behavior. And it was, I truly remember standing in class, listening to this person who did not have the authority or the agency, who shouldn't have had the agency to say these things to me, was, I don't think I got my PhD for this. Do you think it's, yeah, how bad would it be if I went back to Kellogg? So, but I survived. And yeah, I still do know a little bit about OB. Not everything, but a little bit.
Well, thank you both so much. And people are putting their congrats in the chat. And I'll just say that again, it's amazing to hear reflections on 2 powerhouse careers. And so Zoe's gonna wrap us up as our 90 minutes. Time flies when we're having fun.
So yeah.
Thanks, Allison.
My pleasure.
Thank you both so much for sharing. Let me add my congratulations to everyone else's. It's been wonderful to be a small part of your journey. And a few things that kind of I took away from today's session, which given my understanding of both of you over the years don't surprise me, but kind of emphasizing we're in this for the long game. And more important than anything else is how you've invested in people and how that has led to your intellectual and professional and personal growth over the years. And that's been kind of the spark and serendipitous catalyst for so much of how you've evolved as scholars and mentors over the years. And so thinking about kind of how we can model our own careers after you is maintaining that openness and that intellectual curiosity to continue to explore and look for all the ways that we can create value. And the most important way we can do that is working collaboratively and generously with others to accomplish good things. And as Max says, do good work. So thank you all so much. We look forward to seeing you at the rest of the conference. And thanks for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thanks, Maggie, and thanks to everybody who's helped us.
Zoe, Anne, Tina, Allison, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Congratulations.
Thank you, everyone. To Max and Maggie, congratulations. Thank you, Zoe and Anne and Tina and Allison for facilitating such a great session and for everyone here. So thank you very much.
And by the way, it's great seeing people I haven't seen in a really long time. So take care.
Celebrate for real when we're all back in person. I hope this is
I know.
conference, last year for Zoom conferences.
Yes, yes. And if you have time, come join us in the gather. We can chat in smaller groups and have our virtual version of a coffee hour. So see you soon.
Take care.
Guys.